They thought building 35 homes would erase my family's legacy. They didn't know the land remembers, the water obeys, and the law protects those who respect both. One dam, one deed, and decades of knowledge quietly waited, until the day nature and justice reminded Willowbrook Estates who truly owns the land. I didn't say a word when they slid that eviction notice across the table. The room was quiet enough that I could hear the faint tick of the old clock on the wall, the kind of tick that makes you feel time itself is holding its breath. I looked down at the paper in front of me, the neatly printed words, the bold font at the top declaring in cold authority that I had 30 days to vacate, 30 days to pack up generations of history, 30 days to surrender a lifetime of work, of sweat, of family legacy. For a moment, I just sat there. My fingers brushed over the paper, not really feeling it, as though the notice itself were a ghost trying to pretend it had weight. They thought this paper meant power. They thought this was the end of the conversation, the final strike of the gavel. But what they didn't know was that I had been preparing for this moment long before their HOA ever existed. Instead of speaking, I reached into my worn leather satchel, the same bag I had carried through deserts overseas, through checkpoints, through nights where water was more valuable than gold. My hand closed around a single folded document yellowed with age, but stronger than any fresh printed letterhead the HOA could conjure. I slid it across the table, slow and deliberate, and watched their eyes flicker with confusion. It wasn't anger that drove me. It wasn't revenge either. It was something deeper, quiet certainty, the kind that comes when you know the ground you stand on belongs to you, not because you said so, but because time, law, and legacy already declared it. The paper they gave me was an eviction notice. The paper I returned was a water rights deed, signed and sealed in 1923, nearly a century before their so-called Willowbrook Estates was even a dream, on an architect's desk. The man across from me, a representative HOA board, adjusted his tie. He tried to keep his face composed, but I saw it. The slight twitch in his jaw, the nervous flick of his eyes. He didn't understand yet, not fully. To him, this was just another land dispute, another formality where the little guy gets pushed aside. But he was wrong. This wasn't a matter of opinion. This wasn't a matter of who had the bigger law firm or the fancier contracts. This was a matter of rights written in black ink long before his community had its first street lamp. I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence speak louder than words. He skimmed the document, flipping pages he didn't understand, searching for something he could dismiss. But what he found was undeniable. My grandfather's signature, a legal seal, and a line that granted control of the water flowing through this land to my family and my family alone. At that moment, I thought of Pops, my grandfather. I thought of his strong hands building the dam with nothing but grit and good engineering. He had told me stories of lawyers and developers even back then, men who came sniffing around trying to buy the land for a fraction of its worth. But Pops always said the same thing. A land without water is just dirt, but land with water, that's life itself, and life belongs to those who respect it. The HOA had forgotten that truth. They believed land was only about property lines and fence posts, about deeds filed in county offices and tax assessments printed on glossy paper. But Pops knew better. He secured water rights not just for himself, but for his children, his children's children. Land. He saw further than they could ever imagine. The representative finally cleared his throat. This doesn't change the fact, he began, but his voice lacked the confidence he had walked in with. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because he knew as well as I did those 35 homes with their shiny driveways and white fences were built downstream. And water, once released, does not ask for permission. The eviction notice lay between us, looking smaller now, almost laughable next to the 1923 deed. They thought they held authority, but authority without truth is nothing more than paper in the wind. And in that room, with that document spread out before him, the balance of power shifted. I could have spoken then. I could have explained the law, could have told him that federal water rights supersede HOA boundaries every single time. But I chose silence. Silence. Because sometimes the most powerful message is not in words, but in the weight of history. Silence because in that moment the sound of his uncertainty was louder than any argument I could make. You see, eviction notices are designed to scare. They are meant to strip dignity, to push people into submission. They come printed in bold with deadlines and consequences spelled out as if the world itself will collapse if you resist. But there's something they never account for, the resilience of a man standing on land tied to his family's bloodline. As I sat there, my mind wandered back to Afghanistan. I remembered villages where water determined survival. I remembered walking through parched valleys where children carried buckets miles just for a sip. And I remembered how control of water meant control of everything. Land, people, even destiny. That knowledge had followed me home. And now, sitting across from a neatly dressed man representing a board of suburban planners, I realized the same rule applied here. Whoever controls the water controls the future. The irony was almost poetic. They built their paradise without asking the land what it wanted. They planted their fences, paved their roads, and painted their homes, all while ignoring the dam that watched silently from upstream. They assumed nature could be ignored, controlled, bent to their will. But they forgot. Nature remembers. Water remembers. And deeds signed in 1923 remember too. When the meeting ended, he left with the eviction notice still on the table. He didn't take it back because he knew it had already lost its power. I folded the old deed carefully, sliding it back into my satchel. My fingers lingered on it for a moment, not just as a document, but as a reminder. This wasn't about winning a fight. This was about protecting what was always ours. Walking out of that room, the late Texas sun hit my face. I breathed in the dry air, smelled the dust, and listened to the faint sound of water trickling over stones from the dam. It was steady, patient, eternal, just like Pops had built it, just like he had intended. That night, I sat on the porch overlooking the hills. The lights of Willowbrook Estates twinkled in the distance, their streets alive with the hum of suburban life. Families laughed in backyards, children played, and sprinklers hissed across green lawns. They had no idea that their paradise stood on borrowed time. Not because of anger, not because of revenge, but because truth always flows back to where it belongs. And so when they handed me that eviction notice, I didn't argue. I didn't fight. I didn't waste breath on people who thought power was measured in meetings and memos. I just let the silence stretch, and I let the paper of 1923 speak for me. Because in the end, paper may build communities, but water shapes the land. And water has a voice of its own. When people see land, most of them only see numbers. They see property values, development potential, square footage, and tax brackets. But when I look at my land, I see faces, I see memories, and I see a legacy carved out of sweat, calloused hands, and nights spent under Texas skies filled with stars. The HOA never understood that. To them, this was just a piece of real estate. To me, it was my grandfather's promise made real. Pops bought the land in 1955, when Austin was still a sleepy town where barbecue joints and old trucks outnumbered tech companies 1,000 to 1. Back then, people didn't buy land for speculation or profit. They bought it to build a life. Pops used to tell me the day he signed the papers for those 47 acres was the proudest day of his life. He wasn't just buying dirt. He was buying freedom. Freedom from bosses who could fire you at will, freedom from landlords who could raise rent overnight, freedom to plant, build, and dream on soil that was his and his alone. I remember walking the fields with him as a boy. He'd point to the hills and say, "This land is more than just ours. It's part of us. We don't own it. We take care of it, and in return, it takes care of us." Those words sank into me deeper than I realized at the time. When the sun set over the fields, painting everything gold, I believed him. The land felt alive, and so did I. In 1978, Pops built a small earth dam. Nothing fancy, nothing flashy, just good, solid engineering, the kind you do with purpose, not pride. He built it to catch rainwater, to give the cattle a place to drink, and to help the neighbors downstream during dry spells. That dam wasn't just dirt piled up, it was a symbol of cooperation and foresight. He worked with the Army Corps of Engineers on the design, making sure it was safe and reliable. Pops was never one to cut corners, especially not when it came to water. I used to sit on the dam with him, fishing rod in hand, watching the water ripple. He'd tell me stories of his own father, of working through droughts, of how water was always the difference between hardship and survival. Pops knew that someday people would realize just how valuable water really was. One day he'd say, "This land will be worth more than you can imagine, but don't ever let anyone tell you it's just dirt. This land carries our name, our sweat, and our future." And he was right. By the time I was grown, the city had sprawled out like a wildfire, creeping closer every year. What had once been quiet country roads turned into highways. What had once been cattle pastures turned into subdivisions. The skyline of Austin grew taller, and with it came developers, men in suits who spoke in terms of profits and projections, not heritage and history. They came sniffing around, offering Pop's checks with a lot of zeros. He always shook his head. "They don't understand," he'd tell me later. They think money can replace memory, but memory is worth more than money. Pops believed in the kind of wealth that doesn't fit in a bank account. The wealth of knowing your grandchildren would walk the same fields you walked, breathe the same air, and drink the same water. When Pops passed while I was overseas, the land fell into trust, managed by my sister Sarah. She's a good woman, but she lives in California, far removed from Texas soil. No, she didn't grow up the way I did, chasing calves in the pasture, sitting on the dam, or learning to read the weather by the color of the clouds. To her, the land was numbers in a file. She meant no harm, but she didn't have the same fire Pops passed down to me. That's when the HOA saw its chance. The Willowbrook Estate HOA, led by their president Maggie Thornwell, saw 47 acres of underutilized potential. To them, it wasn't a farm. It wasn't legacy. It wasn't Pop's life's work. It was just empty space waiting to be turned into 35 luxury homes with white fences and tennis courts. They ignored the history. They ignored the fact that the dam had been there for decades, quietly shaping the flow of water. They ignored the 1923 deed that gave my family water rights long before Willowbrook had even been imagined. They ignored everything that mattered because in their world, history doesn't pay HOA dues, and legacy doesn't fit on a blueprint. When I came back from Afghanistan, I couldn't believe what I saw. Rolling fields where I once hunted as a boy were now cul-de-sacs. The back 40 acres where Pops had said, someday this will be worth something special," were paved over with driveways and garage doors. Families lived in houses that looked identical, their lawns trimmed, their cars parked neatly in rows. It wasn't a neighborhood, it was a machine, and every house was just another cog. The worst part wasn't that they built it. The worst part was the arrogance with which they dismissed what came before. To them, Pop's dam was just an obstacle on the map. To them, his water rights were a technicality. To them, my family's story was irrelevant. They didn't just build on the land. They built over the past as though by paving it, they could erase it. But here's the truth. Land remembers. Water remembers. And I remembered. Every time I looked at that dam, I thought of Pop's calloused hands placing each stone. I thought of the evenings we spent together fishing in the still water. I thought of his words, "Someday this land will mean more than you know." And as I looked out at the identical rooftops of Willowbrook Estates, I realized he had been right all along. They thought legacy could be ignored. They thought heritage could be bulldozed. They thought water could be contained by property lines and hay is HOA regulations. But legacy is deeper than that. Legacy flows through generations like water through soil. It cannot be erased by a subdivision, no matter how perfectly planned. So when they handed me that eviction notice, thinking they were finishing the story, I realized they hadn't even read the first chapter. They had no idea whose land they had built on, no idea of the rights sealed nearly a century ago, and no idea of the quiet strength waiting upstream. Legacy, once ignored, has a way of rising again. Sometimes it rises in memory, sometimes in law, and sometimes it rises in water. And the AAAO was about to learn that Pop's legacy was still alive, still strong, and still flowing, whether they respected it or not. On the surface, Willowbrook Estates looked like the perfect dream. Rows of identical houses lined freshly paved streets, each one painted in muted tones of beige, cream, or gray, safe colors chosen to match the uniformity demanded by the HOA board. Manicured lawns stretched across every yard, green and flawless thanks to irrigation systems running day and night. Children rode bikes down cul-de-sacs, sprinklers created arcs of mist in the evenings, and neighbors waved politely as they trimmed hedges to meet exact HOA standards. It looked peaceful. It looked prosperous. It looked like paradise. But paradise built on stolen ground is never real. It's a house of cards, standing tall only until the truth comes knocking. When the Willowbrook Estates, HOA, marketed their homes, they sold the dream of suburban perfection. They promised security, exclusivity, and community living at its finest. They boasted about the swimming pool, the tennis courts, the fitness center, and the strict HOA rules that have protected property values. They even threw in the buzzwords: a luxury lifestyle, a prime location, a future growth. Buyers believed it. Families flocked in, eager to escape the chaos of the city for this carefully packaged vision of small-town comfort. But what the glossy brochures didn't mention was the foundation upon which it was all built: my family's land. Land that wasn't theirs to claim. Land that carried a legacy ignored, rights overlooked, and history erased with every nail driven into new wooden frames. The irony was sharp. They built their community downstream of a dam they pretended didn't exist. Every HOA meeting celebrated the growing property values, but not one board member questioned the strange little hill upstream or the decades-old deed filed at the county courthouse that made their paradise fragile. They paved over questions, painted over doubts, and convinced themselves that paperwork signed in the last 20 years mattered more than paperwork signed a century ago. It was almost poetic. They called Willowbrook Estates a master-planned community. But the truth was that their so-called master plan had a fatal flaw. It was built without respect for the land itself. From the outside looking in, you couldn't tell. The streets were quiet, the fences were white, the gardens carefully tended. On Saturday mornings, residents gathered at the tennis courts, sipping iced tea between matches. Mothers pushed strollers, fathers mowed lawns, and children played in driveways under the watchful eye of golf cart patrols driven by HOA volunteers in pressed polo shirts. But beneath the surface, the land remembered. I drove past those homes one evening, the sun setting behind them, casting long shadows across their carefully trimmed yard. I slowed down and watched the sprinklers hiss across green grass that didn't belong there, watered by resources they didn't control. Each drop of water they wasted on appearances came from a source older than their community, older than their contracts. They thought they were secure, but their very security was an illusion, a castle built on sand. The residents had no idea. They had bought into the dream, trusting the HOA to handle the detail. They signed contracts without reading the fine print, wrote checks without asking questions, and placed their trust in a board that believed authority could erase truth. It wasn't their fault entirely. They were ordinary families chasing the American dream. But dreams can sour quickly when built on deception. The board, however, knew better. They had been warned. When the development first broke ground, there were whispers about the water rights, about the dam, about the old family that had owned the land for decades. But those whispers were silenced. Lawyers filed papers, developers smoothed over questions, and the HOA convinced itself that history didn't matter if enough money was poured into the project. That's the lie of Willowbrook Estates. The belief that progress is stronger than legacy, that paperwork can erase memory, and that the land will bend to human arrogance. Walking my property, I often stopped at the edge where the dam overlooked the valley. From there, I could see the rooftops of Willowbrook Estates stretching out like a sea of conformity. 35 homes, identical in design, identical in purpose, identical in their false sense of permanence. To them, it was a neighborhood. To me, it was a monument to greed. I thought of Pops. I thought of the way he used to shake his head whenever developers came knocking. He'd say, they see houses. I see history. They see profit. I see promise. And promise always outlasts profit. The HOA never understood that. They thought building tennis courts and swimming pools gave them permanence. They thought enforcing lawn height regulations gave them power. They thought fines, notices, and bylaws made them invincible. But all of it was built on a lie. And lies, no matter how carefully constructed, eventually collapse. As the weeks passed, their arrogance grew. They sent letters threatening fines if I didn't trim weeds near the property line. They held meetings about a future expansion into areas they didn't legally own. They bragged in their newsletters about rising property values, all while ignoring the fact that their paradise rested on ground claimed long before they ever arrived. I stayed quiet. I didn't argue. I didn't protest. I didn't need, because I knew something they didn't. Paradise built on lies can't stand forever. Truth always finds a way to rise. Just like water behind a dam, steady, patient, inevitable. The residents of Willowbrook Estates continued their lives in ignorance. Birthday parties in backyards, barbecues on patios, children splashing in pools. But behind their joy was a secret they didn't see, a truth their board refused to acknowledge. Their homes, their lawns, their entire community existed only because the dam had been merciful. And mercy has its limits. That's the danger of lies. They create comfort until the moment they're exposed. I saw it in villages where warlords diverted rivers thinking they could control entire populations with dams. I saw it when engineers ignored warnings about weak soil and watched projects collapse. And I was seeing it again here in Texas, in the polished streets of Willowbrook Estates. The HOA was blind to the truth sitting upstream. But I wasn't. I knew the math. I knew the flow. I knew that Pop's Dam, while small by modern standards, was perfectly capable of reminding anyone downstream that water always wins. I spent evenings at the dam, running my hand along the packed clay, checking the spillway gates, measuring the levels after each rainfall. I wasn't angry. I was calculating. Not out of revenge, but out of respect. For Pops, for the land, for the knowledge he passed down, and the training I received. Every sandbag I had stacked overseas, every canal I had dug, every blueprint I had memorized came back to me when I looked at that dam. The HOA thought they were playing a game of contracts and signatures. I was playing a game of physics and patience. Knowledge changes the way you see the world. As the gates of the dam opened and the water slowly crept across the pristine streets of Willowbrook Estates, Jake stood silently at the ridge, watching the consequences unfold. He knew that once the water rose, lawyers would come running. The same system that the HOA thought they could bend would suddenly turn against them. Federal water law is clear, and those 1923 rights were ironclad. The HO had underestimated patience. They believed that lawsuits, bylaws, and meetings could erase decades of stewardship. They assumed their new community could rewrite history. But time and gravity do not bend for human arrogance. The moment Jake opened the gates, the slow, quiet justice began.